thank you very much, Flores, for that very kind introduction. And let me say to what Vladimir was saying earlier, that he hoped that I also benefit from this. I do very, very much. I already had a very interesting discussion this morning in this very room. And I tried to explain at that time how much people who are doing the kind of work I'm doing need this kind of discussion and exchange with people in very different situations. We're always inventing world history out of our own experience, and the experience has to become broader. So I'm very grateful for this chance to be here to talk to you about these issues. And I'm going to take up now this question of ethics, really, and starting from the following, I think, fact that we notice around ourselves. In today's world, the question of how to act, how to be a moral person or how to be an ethical person is usually posed in terms of rules or norms. There are, of course, whole philosophies that you see, that Benthamite utilitarians, that are Neo-Kantians, who think that the big issue for moral philosophy is finding a criterion to tell you when a norm is obligatory and when it is not. But then beyond, it's not just a philosophy, a phenomenon of philosophy, it's also a phenomenon of our world where our lives are immensely enshrined or encased in certain codes. In the political world, bureaucracies operate by rules. In our various professions, there are rules, there are codes of deontology, and in our the central values of our political life, we have charters of rights, very, very valuable instruments, once again telling us what is right to do, what is wrong to do, what people's rights are, what the importance of equality, and so on. So it looks like the entire question of ethics is a matter of norms, what you ought to do, what you ought not to do. And the case I want to plead today is that that's a very inadequate view of moral life. That these codes are valuable, sometimes indispensable, but they're like the surface of a many-dimensional world, right? Simply a surface. It's like seeing the world laid out on a map, and you don't see that it encases a really substantial reality underneath it. Or to put it in other terms, these codes always need to be put in a context to be really valuable. So I'm going to try to explain that, and its explanation is going to take the form of allowing us to look into this background, to use a different metaphor. Codes of the surface, and there's a deeper background which we need in order to act properly on these codes. So let's move inch by inch into the deeper background. Now, one of the structures of this argument I'd like to put forward is this, that in order to get a complete understanding of ethics, we need three kinds of concepts or ideas. We do need norms, statements of what to do or not to do, but we also need, secondly, understandings of what is good. What's a good life? What's a valuable life? What's a good way of being a human being? And we also need, that's the second, as it were, basket of concepts. And we also need to draw on a third basket of concepts, which are what we usually call virtues. Right? These are facets of a good way of being human, which each pick out a certain aspect of that and talk about it in terms of its motivating power. Being courageous, being generous, being open to other people, being understanding, and so on. These are virtues which characterize a good way of being a human being. So there are norms, there are goals or goods, and there are virtues. So let me launch into this bigger background with that basket in the back of our minds and start right away to see why we need these to actually act in the world. We need to go beyond the codes, actually to act in the world. right away you can see, I think, that codes or rules require what I'm calling goods. I mean, let's look at the code we all want to live by today in our different polities, the code of human rights in the various ways it's been drawn up in our different constitutions. So human beings have a right to life, a right to freedom, for instance, a right to lead their own lives. All right, but now just think what that means concretely, right to freedom. Does it mean that whatever they think they want to do, they should be allowed to do, provided it doesn't bother anyone else? Or do we have, when we start to apply this right to freedom, do we have in the back of our minds some sense of what's important in human life? For instance, somebody in Canada, I would say in the west of Canada, made a complaint to the courts because of the rule in his province that drivers should wear a seatbelt, and he said this was infringing his freedom. Actually, it was in Alberta, and the lowest court gave him the right, but when it went to the Supreme Court, this was knocked down. Why was it knocked down? Because this is a relatively, in human terms, trivial issue, that I have the right not to wear a seatbelt, and there are other very powerful considerations of general welfare that give a reason to enforce that law. But if it was a matter of his not having a right to declare his opinion in politics, if it was a matter of his not having a right to practice his religion, everyone would agree right away this is something unacceptable. So you can see that already in the background of these codes that we apply are background understandings which have to do with what? With what's really important in human life. That's what they have to do with. I mean, what are the goods that human beings seek? And if I claim liberty in order to be able to encompass a relatively trivial good, then it may not be accepted because of the cost. But if I claim the right to be able to exercise an extremely important central human good, then it will be granted to me. So you can get this sense right away that there's a background. That's what the idea I want to bring forward. There's a kind of deeper background that we're operating against and that require this kind of judgment. Now here we get to really Aristotle. I'm sorry to introduce him here, but I think he's one of the greatest moral philosophers of all time. And Aristotle was aware that rules are never enough. And he tried to argue that people need a certain kind of discernment, a certain ability to discern in particular situations what is really important, what is really good, in order to decide in particular situations what they ought to do. So for him, never was the rule itself enough. You have to have another kind of understanding. And this is the first dimension, first aspect of that kind of understanding that I've just been talking about. But now the background goes deeper, and the need for this kind of discernment, Aristotle's word phronesis, we sometimes translate practical reason, let's say ability to discern, discernment. The need for this kind of discernment gets even greater when we fill in the background more, because it not only is a question of there being certain goods that are the background to our rules, but we also have another level of complication, that there are many goods. And we often find ourselves in human life in situations where two different goods are in balance against each other. It doesn't seem to be possible to pursue them both at once. If you pursue this one, you have to give up to some extent that one, and vice versa. So the second thing I want to say, therefore, is that human life is full of moral dilemmas. Dilemmas because we don't know which way to go. I mean, I think of certain examples that we all can see, that you see in politics. I mean, for instance, liberty and equality sometimes are balanced against each other. Justice and mercy. Commutative justice, that is retributive justice, and comity. Efficient success and compassionate understanding. Getting things done bureaucratically, which requires categories and rules, and treating everyone as a unique person. And we can go on and on and on. our life is actually full of these dilemmas, where we not only have to think of applying the rules with the background of a good, or some goods, but we are faced actually with a tough choice. Which goods? Right? And we start to try to reason, and usually you try to make the decision that gives the least harm to both goods in competition with each other. The solution which harms them both least, or on balance least, is the one that you go for. But you have to think about that, and you have to ponder it in the light of those dilemmas. Well, now, things are even worse than that in moral life, if you really unpack fully its complexity, because sometimes you have, always, actually, these different goods that you're balancing are going to be the claims of different people who are plugging for one or other of these goods. And you also have to think not only of the damage to the goods or how much you're fulfilling them or denying them, you also have to think of the people. Now let me try to give an example of where I've got so far, which I think really illustrate this. And I'll take it from politics, but we can find it in moral life. I want to look at an example which I find very interesting and very inspiring. In the whole development that we've seen in recent decades in the world, where we have seen very despotic and inhumane regimes overturned and more moderate or democratic or just regimes established, a question has arisen: how much ought we to punish the people who are responsible for the terrible things that were done under the old regime? And we see across the areas that have been freed from communist regimes all the different answers to this question in different societies. But here's a classic example of a dilemma. Because on one hand, you might say we should carry out the maximum of retributive justice against people who've done really terrible things. And the more you look at the things they've done, the more you feel that's so. On the other hand, going right the way, full way with this could, because there are a large number of such people who are semi-involuntarily involved in this, may make it very hard to construct a new society in which we live together in some degree of comity. So some people have decided, De Gaulle, after the Second World War, decided we're going to one or two very clear cases like Pétain and Laval, but for the rest of it we're going to just deny the past and not admit that there were a lot of collaborators, right? And that was, you understand why he did that, in order to turn the page and let French society go forward. But this leaves a certain need, a certain claim unmet. So we found in the recent wave, I've been talking about the last 20 years, of such regime changes, and I want to single out South Africa as the example, an attempt to find a new kind of solution, which was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now this meant that those people who really been badly treated and wounded under apartheid were denied what normally they want, and you can understand, seeing the perpetrators really properly punished. But the gain that they would get from that was really having it known exactly who did what and to whom. Right? That it was that unlike regimes of simple amnesty, where you cover all this with silence and nobody knows anymore, nobody needs to declare what happened. The rule was, if you came forward and confessed everything, you were not to be prosecuted, but if you refused to, you would be prosecuted. So we had on one hand the people who felt the need for retribution were frustrated. On the other hand, those who had perpetrated these deeds didn't get away totally freely. They had the humiliation of having to admit in public. And what was thought to be the great gain here, something you didn't see with earlier measures of amnesty, is that one of the really deeply frustrating things for people who suffered is that the whole suffering is covered over in silence and nobody knows and they don't even quite know who did it, and it's just, everyone says, be quiet, shut up, let's just not talk about this, right? That pain, at least, was lifted from the people who suffered. Can you see this kind of dilemma here? The kind of dilemma here, you see, is one that people are struggling with on two levels. They're struggling with it on the more abstract level of what is more important, retributive justice or the future comity, future mutual understanding which we may be able to build. These are two goods. But we've also got to look at it on the level of the people concerned. Here are people who have actually suffered, right? And they have very sore feelings. How much should we give to that as consideration, as against simply looking at the goods? So we're getting a very complicated world, but that's the real world. That you not only need to understand the goods behind the rules, you sometimes need to understand what goods are in conflict. And you sometimes need to understand further the actual living human beings whose desires and fears and hopes and sense of being hard done by are in play in these decisions. All that goes into the decision. So we have a very complex world, but it gets more complex. And it gets more complex because, as you can see from this example, where I brought in the whole issue of the actual human beings concerned behind the claims, not just the claim of retributive justice, but the claim of these people who've been, tortured in apartheid prisons and so on. You see from that in actual fact, the space that's open for resolution depends very heavily on how people, in the end, come to experience and understand what they've been through. Right? And this is where the Truth and Reconciliation Commission really did something remarkable, because they were proposing to people to understand their situation in a different way. So don't think only of the need for retribution. Think of how we're going to go forward together in a single society, right? And of course, the danger that lurked behind a policy of retribution to the last, as it were, iota, the last element, was a specter of revenge for revenge and revenge for revenge for revenge, and so on. The Mandela and Tutu had very much before their minds the sense that in order to go ahead, we have to transform our way of understanding this and feeling about it, and precisely introduce that notion of truth and reconciliation, truth as against retribution, and a reconciliation arising out of this. What really was required, therefore, was that people come to see their situation in a new light. And that, of course, is one of the crucial features in history, that when you're looking at what is possible in a dilemma, on that level of not just the goods, but the human beings, it's crucially important what these human beings can, out of their own capacity, can bring up as their final interpretation of what's important here. So you had an attempt by Mandela and Tutu to take the existing situation in which people only and more mainly felt very aggrieved at what had been done to them, and ask them to redefine their situation, that they look at it not only as aggrieved individuals, but as citizens of the future country together, and therefore see it in other terms. Right? Now this introduces a very important complication, but a very profound human complication, that human beings can transform their understanding of things, and when they transform their understanding of things, certain solutions to the original dilemma become possible that weren't possible before. Because if everybody had remained absolutely convinced that the only important thing was to get their own back, get retribution for what happened to them, if no one could have been induced to see it in this other light as well, the solution wouldn't have worked. Just wouldn't have worked. It requires some kind of transformation. So what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with not just goods in conflict, not just dilemmas caused by goods in conflict, but we're dealing with another dimension of potential change in which people can come to see their situation differently and therefore make possible solutions to dilemmas which are in a certain very important sense superior because they allow reconciliation, comity, working together, becoming citizens together, in a way that other solutions, lower down the scale, do not, because they will satisfy certain demands that will, as it were, undermine future comity. There's this. Now here, the dilemma becomes a trilemma, or a double dilemma. You're Mandela or Tutu, and you're thinking about this. And you're saying to yourself, yeah, it would have been much better if we could go forward to that new understanding. But maybe we can't. Maybe we're making a mistake here. Maybe we're trying to push people too far, and actually it'll just produce much worse consequences, right? So they have the original dilemma, and then they have a meta-dilemma, a real question about how to try to move forward out of the dilemma. If you try just to jump to angelic love of the neighbor, you're not going to do that, and if that's the supposition of your solution, then it's going to be a catastrophic failure. It requires, there is here a mixture of deep moral insight, deep humanity, and great political savvy. That's what you've got to call it. I mean, another figure like that is in 20th century history is Gandhi, of course, the same kind of thing, trying to get people to understand their situation of trying to get rid of the British Empire, right, in the context of a ethic of ahimsa, of nonviolence, right? To see that when they get clubbed by the police with their lathis and so on, the obvious reaction, oh, we're going to get back at these people, is the one, that's not the one to take. The real victory is to be able to stand up under that and still be standing up, and the result was, of course, that they got their victory, which doesn't mean that it'll always be that case. I mean, people have said, what would have happened if Gandhi had tried that, against the Hitler regime? The answer would be massacre. Yeah, so there are issues always of political judgment here. And all of this, it goes into the phronesis of a really, phronimos, as Aristotle said, a really wise person. And you can see how immensely complex it is. That we have this, not only the two-dimensional situation of the two goods that are in balance against each other and the two claimants, but also this third or vertical dimension of how much we can transform ourselves to go beyond this. And just let's look at this with another example to get another hold on it. If you look at societies where, for instance, there's a very well-established, very long-established practice of vendetta, you kill my brother, I'm going to kill your brother, and then you've got to come back and kill my cousin, and so on. And then you try in that situation to establish some kind of rule of law. Well, it's extremely difficult because you can't effectively establish a rule of law until a certain number of people can be induced to understand their situation in quite different terms, right? That's just to say that these dilemmas between two goods are always also conflicts between two claims of two kinds of human beings, and the content of those claims has a lot to do with how people understand each other, understand their situation, and which may change in history for the better and change in history for the worse. Now, can I now try to relate this to Christianity, to the gospel, to see this notion already there, in a sense? A good example of totally impossible unacceptable solution to a problem, which is nevertheless a great step forward. The parable of the vineyard, the owner of the vineyard calls in people, this, I've forgotten where exactly it occurs, and the people who come in the first hour work all day, and he tells them they give them a penny, and the people come in the third hour going to get a penny, etc. And then the people who come in the last hour, they come up at the end and they get a penny. And the people at the first hour are saying, look, what's going on here? I mean, is this your idea of relative justice and compensation? These people have been just an hour and we've been working in the heat of the day. Well, what you have here, I think, in the New Testament is a view really way into where that third dimension can go, where people are transformed enough so that the way God sees it is something that they can live with. And the way God sees it is everybody is worth nothing, and we need to be saved, right? So you get this sense of, we get moments in the New Testament when the far reaches of that third dimension are visible to us. And so we've had this struggle. This is the way dilemmas are lived out in Christian history, that we always have this sense of the eschatological perspective and what is really appropriate there, but we find ourselves way far behind that, and we have to somehow deal with the issues where we are, or where we are plus the little bit that we can hope to edge up, the kind of thing that Mandela and Tutu were on about. And I don't know about Mandela, but certainly Tutu got the idea of moving up this way from the New Testament, right? From the notion of forgiveness. And but that, so we see that, I mean, in a certain sense, the gospel has trained us to see things in this light, and also to see the fragility of trying to go too fast, too far. Now, let's go back and look again at the reasons for this fixation on codes, which really wants to deny that background and think that the code, the rule book, is enough. And part of the fixation is due to kind of rationalism, of oversimple rationalism. It's possible to work out, particularly if you have a kind of Kantian approach, which there's a lot to be said for it, it's possible to work out pretty convincingly a given charter of rights, for instance. See that basically Kantian idea, how would you like to be treated, and treat others like that, and so should people have a right to life? Well, obviously. Should people have a right to liberty? Well, obviously, and so on. It's possible to work that out in terms of a quite strong, generally accepted, rational argument. But these other features that I've been talking about, that belong to that background, are much more difficult to work out with general agreement. What is really important in human life? Well, to a certain point, I said earlier, we can all agree on that. But when we get to other kinds of more subtle cases, maybe we don't. I mean, maybe people have a very strong view that religion is nonsense, so we don't really need to give people the liberty to practice their religion. Or maybe they think, the other way around, that people that simply want to choose their own vocation in lay life, that's not very important, so and so on. So we're going to have differences on that level. And when we get to these deeper issues of how to balance these goods, when we get beyond that to the deeper issues of how to balance these claims, when we get beyond that to the issue of can we move further up in this vertical dimension, then we're not dealing with things that can be easily decided to everyone's satisfaction by very clear arguments. So the rationalist side of our modern culture pushes you to say, well, that doesn't really matter. Let's get down to the rules. But there's something else that also is working in, I would say, code fixation, and that is something more, less pretty, I think more worrying. There also, codes of ethics can be very satisfying to apply if you are ready to, you're in such a motivational state and so on that you're ready to apply them. And then you have to apply them to others who are reluctant, who are falling down and have to be brought into line. The ones that are not really in control and who are bad. But if we, and so a lot of people get a certain amount of sense of pleasure and superiority from this. I mean, the superiority in relation to those who can't live up to the code, and a certain sense of rightful power in enforcing the code. But if you take seriously what I said just a minute ago about the third dimension, then there's something self-blind about this, right? I mean, let me give you examples, right? So you owe me money. So I demand you pay me, I demand you pay me back, regardless. I'm not interested in your situation, I'm not interested in what your children need now. You pay me back the money, it's my right. Now, what does that do in relation to this moving up and down a dimension? Let's say in a small society, in a small group, just to look at it at first. That pushes the general atmosphere, the general understanding of ordered group in the direction of, well, yeah, a set of rules where, yeah, everybody, sure, insists on their right, regardless. And we find ourselves, in this case, maybe moving down, right, where people are so insisting on their rights that there aren't solutions that could be found with a greater degree of mutual commitment, of goodwill, and so on. So the people who are applying a code and applying it to others need to ask themselves, what am I doing to that general background understanding of how we live together? Am I pushing it up? Am I pushing it down? This dimension that I've been talking about before. In other words, they could be, if they looked at themselves, they could see themselves as being as much part of the problem as they are of the solution. And it's that kind of vision on oneself that again, you see constantly in the New Testament. The sense that when you look at how terrible the world is, God, the awful people are out there, just can't believe it. How do we have to deal with those people? That maybe, look at yourself, and there's a famous line in Dostoevsky's Possessed where the hero says, one of the wrong people, the sort of scientific-minded people saying it's all a matter of, mechanistic causation, no one is to blame. And the answer Dostoevsky is giving is when the hero says, we are all to blame, the sense of it's something we're all contributing to, and we have to see that in ourselves. And you get this great moment in the New Testament, I think that's John 10, the woman caught in adultery, and they want to get Jesus' agreement to this. And he says, let him who is without sin cast the first stone, and they walk away one by one. But, what the miracle there is getting them to make that focus on their own responsibility. So there's a way in which code fixation can serve the purpose of denying this responsibility, of feeling that you're just part of the solution, not part of the problem. And you see this again and again when countries go to war. Wars against terror, which are a very, very dubious concept anyway, can be declared out of the sense that, we have nothing to do with this. We didn't cause this, but we have to clean it up, right? So let's look at this this dimension of going up and down. But before that, I want to introduce, I think here we can see where we have to introduce what I call the third basket of concepts. They're the rules, they're the goods, and then they're the virtues. In a certain sense, you see, what can protect you against this forgetting your own part, what's emanating from me, what I am creating in this situation. what is needed is a certain number of certain kind of virtues, that is, human excellences which carry their own motivation. For instance, humility, ability really to see myself from the outside, ability to see my own part in the kind of world that has been created, generosity, and so on, not to mention, of course, the three famous theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. Now, virtue, as Aristotle points out, is when you actually are in a state of character where you're actually moved by the good concern. In other words, you're not just pained by having to notice your own part in it, but also deeply moved by that, something that you want to be able to see. And so what we need to overcome this kind of particular kind of code fetishism, which can be motivated by that desire to be only part of the solution, not part of the problem, is a certain number of virtues. But let's now look at the rationalistic outlook, both the rationalism and this kind of satisfaction with code fixation, which is so powerful. What makes it powerful, and how does it deal with the third dimension, with this dimension of up and down? Well, how it deals with that third dimension is by a theory of civilization, of development, right? So we're pretty good now. We're really civilized, and we believe in human rights and freedom and democracy, and those other people don't. And we are that because we went through this long process of civilization, and maybe even Christianity had something to do with that way back, and now we're here, and they're way back there. So what we have to say to those people is shape up, or listen to us, or be advised by us, or be, in the 19th century, controlled by us so that you can be, and so on, and you'll get yourselves to shape up to this level. And the idea was simply that the process of civilization will resolve this, will bring people up to that level, and then they can be held to the high standards that we have. But then let's look at this process of civilization, and this is something that I try to deal with in the secular age, really. What we think of as the process of civilization has three facets, and there's a fourth one it doesn't talk about enough. One is that the development of civilization brings power. I mean, just think of the development of disciplines in modern European society, of which Foucault spoke in Sur les Punis or other works. Disciplines of the person, self-control, disciplines of the organization, organized bureaucracies, organized armies, disciplined armed forces, and so on. They produce tremendous power. The societies that take these on and develop these institutions, at a certain point, walked over the rest of the earth. They made big empires, and there was constant attempt by societies threatened by this to take on some of these disciplines in order to counter that and in order to maintain their independence, and so on. So that was one aspect of civilization. And there's another aspect, and we think why we're proud of being in civilization. There's the aspect of refinement, of a sense of beauty, of a sense of what is really important in our private lives or our aesthetic lives, sense of style. And there's a third dimension that we feel very good about in our civilization, that it has very high moral standards. That we have, for instance, these standards of human rights and democracy and non-discrimination. So really higher norms, right? We feel very good about that. But you see, all this can be, to revert to what I was saying a bit earlier, all this can be at the expense of the heart, at the expense of understanding of why people are not exactly on our wavelength, understanding of how we've generated a world in which perhaps it's difficult for them to get on our wavelength. So what we need is, again, a set of virtues. What Confucians call human-heartedness, I mean, it's one translation. What the Buddha called karuna, compassion. and what we in Christian tradition call agape, charity, love. This is something that this kind of virtue can manage to cancel or at least mitigate the ways in which the building of civilization, simply as the building of power, or simply as the introduction of these very high norms, can in various ways, in various circumstances, crush people, push them into boxes that they can't live in, and so on and so on. That sense of the particular situation and its demand, which is, I think, at the heart of what we see in the New Testament. And so, there has been, of course, a recognition of this third dimension, of this dimension of going higher and lower in our theories of civilizational development. But once again, the way that they're applied, the way that they're looked at, the way that we're so satisfied with ourselves for having made this progress, shows that we are unaware of our own role in this. Once again, all this turns our attention away from our own role in degrading the world situation. And then you get people who are very, very angry when you point this out at the just shortly after, 1 year after the terrible events of 9/11, the Canadian Prime Minister, who is not necessarily my most favorite politician, but he did say something very wise on a television interview. They talked to him about this. It was absolutely terrible. Maybe we have to think of the way in which the advanced and rich countries have behaved in relation to the developing countries. You know, maybe that's something to do. We have to rethink what we've been doing about all this to produce that kind of anger. And there was an outburst of anger in the United States. We practically had to flee to the North Pole because said, you're blaming the victim, we're totally innocent, this is awful aggression. See, there was this, that people get into this very strong, armored situation in which they cannot bring themselves to look at their own contribution to the mess we're in. Even though, poor Chrétien, he wasn't trying to blame anybody specifically, he wasn't trying to point a finger, just, he was talking about himself too, because he's, he's a prime minister of one of the fat, rich country, which I live in, right? And we're not looking at what we're doing in the whole world very much ourselves, so it was self-criticism as much as anyone else, but there is this tremendous anger and self-righteousness there, which prevents people hearing that. So, the last thing I want to say is, how do you move things into this higher in this third dimension? And as I say, if you have political power, that's one question, but then you can make this kind of very difficult and delicate assessment that Mandela and Tutu made. But I'm talking to people who aren't necessarily in political power, who have an institution here that's really, as I've seen in the last 24 hours, quite remarkable institution in the standards you've set yourselves, in the attempt to understand what's going on, and the attempt to form people who really can understand this. And I think you're practicing another of the ways in which perhaps things can go higher in this third dimension, which is living a certain example. Living a certain example without self-righteousness or without necessarily going out there and preaching, though some of that may be useful too, telling people what they ought to do. But just showing that it's possible to create islands in which the mutual understanding of what you're about and of what we owe to each other allows this higher degree of comity, this higher degree of understanding, this higher degree of mutual respect and mutual sympathy, which we're all looking for, which is in the line of that third dimension that we get out of the gospel. So you set up a little island, perhaps, in which this can be lived, and there is a real hope that this can catch on, that people can see from outside that there's something important here. And in that sense, I think there's something perhaps we can all do, but particularly institutions like this can do to move us in that direction while being conscious of your own contribution or failures to contribute, but mostly there'll be positive contributions to that situation. That is, this kind of living an example is not living blind to the effect you're having, not living blind to the way you can alter the situation, make it better and worse, but living in the light of that in such a way as to give an example to the world around you. So for all those reasons, I'm very happy to have come here and to be able to talk to you about this, because I think it's really comes close to what you're all about. So thank you very much, and let's have questions and objections.